Well, last week, or 2 weeks ago to be exact.
While we're waiting for people, is there a shir next week? Does it interfere with
Yeah, we'll ask at the end of the shir, Mitzvah Shem. So we got up to page 175 for those who are following the pages, and we were talking about the fact that we don't get benefit. Rabbeinu Bachai emphasizes we don't get hana from the possessions of Amalek. Here on page 175, he introduces a chiddush of the Binyan Ariel, who was the Rav in Amsterdam. And he says the following, that the reason why Shaul had sinned was partially because he allowed the possessions of Amalek to remain intact. He did not destroy the animals of Amalek. And in the case of Mordechai, he writes that Mordechai had a very special interest in the issue of Biza of Amalek. And in fact, when the Jewish people went out to battle against Amalek, at the end of Megillas Esther, it says, Uba Biza lo sholchu es yadam. Apparently, Mordechai had instructed them not to benefit from the rechush of Mordechai, of Amalek. And the reason for that is because Mordechai, according to Reb Shaul Amsterdamer, wanted to rectify the sin of his great-great-grandfathers, because Mordechai was a descendant of Shaul HaMelech. Shaul had illegally benefited from the animals of Amalek, and therefore Mordechai wanted to make sure that with regard to this prohibition of enjoying the possessions and benefiting from them of Amalek, but Biza lo sholchu es yadam. And he quotes a Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva Perek Beis. The Rambam asks, what is the highest level of tshuva that a person could achieve? What's called tshuva shlema, tshuva gemura. And that is when a person finds himself in a similar situation in which he fell in the past, he sinned, and now in that very situation, he avoids sin. That's tshuva gemura. And in the case of Mordechai, he found himself going out to battle, sending the Jews out to battle against Amalek in the same situation. Would they benefit from the biza, from the rechush of Amalek? As Shaul had taken the rechush of Amalek in biza against the law, so that Mordechai was very careful in doing a tshuva gemura by not benefiting from the rechush of Amalek. And at this point, we have to introduce a fundamental principle of the Shalah HaKadosh. He says that a person is obligated not only to work and rectify on his own sins, but also l'taken es chet avosav. That's why we say in Vidui, anachnu b'avoseinu chatanu. Why are we reciting Vidui about the sins of our fathers? Because we are obligated to rectify the sins of our fathers. Ubi also davar atzma shel kilkul, in that very same item that brought our ancestors down when they sinned, bo yitaknu atoldos, the descendants should rectify those very sins. And he writes, b'chol dor v'dor, roi libonim l'saken es avonam v'esavon avoseyem. Not only should they be rectifying their own sins and doing tshuva, but they should be doing tshuva for the sins of their fathers. Ubi also davar atzma shekilkul avos, bo yitaknu atoldos abadim achreim v'yomru b'libam avotseinu chato v'enam v'anachnu avonoseyim sovlim. We are going to carry, so to speak, the weight and the guilt of our forefathers' sins, and l'taknom k'fiyah yechol, we'll do our maximum to rectify the sins of our ancestors. A fascinating new idea, which sheds a light on the nusach havidui, avol anachnu v'avoseinu chatanu. we are called upon to do tshuva and to be attacking the sins of our forefathers. And since the greatest tikkun and tshuva is always when you find yourself in the identical situation as the sin itself and you desist, that's what Mordechai was doing when he warned the people of Israel, go out to battle against Amalek, don't enjoy the benefit of their possessions. Ubabiza lo sholchu es yadam. And in order to emphasize this idea that Mordechai is a descendant of Shaul HaMelech, and therefore he's in a position to make that tikkun on the sin of Shaul HaMelech, the Megillah actually gives us the lineage of Mordechai. Listen carefully. Mordechai ben Yair ben Shimei ben Kish ish yemini. Now wait a second. If you count the generations from Mordechai back to Kish, it's 4 generations. Mordechai is the son of Yair, who's the son of Yair. That's a nice name, Yair. Ben Shimei, the son of Shimei, Ben Kish. So we're going back 1, 2, 3, 4 generations. And yet, the truth is that between Mordechai and Kish, there are actually 10 generations. How do we know this? So if you take a look here, fascinating footnote number 35, in the name of the Targum Sheni on Esther Perek Beis, count the generations. Mordechai, Bar Yair, Bar Shimei, Bar Shmida, Bar Bana, Bar Elah, Bar Micha, Bar Mephibosheth, Bar Yonasan, Ben Shaul, Bar Kish. Unbelievable. The yichus here to Shimei goes back a few generations, and the yichus back to Kish goes back 10 generations, and here it's only 4 generations. Apparently, the Megillah wanted to go out of its way to point out that Mordechai was a descendant of Kish. Now, who is Kish? Kish is the father of Shaul HaMelech. So by mentioning Kish, the Megillah is being merames, is alluding to the fact that Mordechai is a descendant of Shaul. The Ibn Ezra, by the way, in his commentary, he vacillates back and forth whether or not Mordechai was a descendant, in fact, of Shaul. But we see clearly from the Targum Sheni and from this presentation that, in fact, not only was Mordechai a descendant of Shaul, but moreover, he was a tikkun for the Avera of his great-great-great-great-grandfather, Shaul HaMelech.
So why is Shaul not mentioned in the genealogy?
We'll get to that.
The king, which is a pretty prominent position.
So for that, you're going to have to look at page 191, but we have a few pages to get to, so hold on. To make a note of it, page 191, which you have, David was kind enough to send out to us.
Yeah, something I want to say. Yeah, that in the Nusach Ashkenaz, we don't say Avosenu. We just say Anachnu Chatanu.
Okay, but I think the Rambam has Avosenu, if I'm not mistaken.
He was an Ashkenazi. Of course not.
Al Ken Yesh Omrim. But again, I don't have a matzah or time to look it up, but I'm pretty sure we do mention Avosenu in maybe in that context. Anyway, so he says in the name of 36, the Megillah Starim, that these names are only Roshei Prakim. And the Megillah skips many generations in order to get back to Kish, who is the father of Shaul. And this means that the Megillah wants to emphasize that we should know that there's a yichus of mishpacha from Mordechai back to Shaul HaMelech, and the actions of Mordechai are connected to those of his ancestor Shaul L'Tikun Cheto Shel Shaul. Now, in a paragraph here, he points out a Yalkut that Mordechai was Melech al Yisrael. I don't know exactly what that means halachically, because there are many conditions necessary for Minu Melech, but he points out that the entire story about Haman dressing up Mordechai in the Big Day Malchus is all about the status of Mordechai as a melech. And the Yalkut in Medrash says, in the name of Rabbi Pinchas, Mordechai Melech al Yisrael. Shenemar uMordechai yotza milufnei Amalek, ma Melech lovesh, etc., etc. And Mordechai also wore the clothes of Amalek. And therefore, it's very important that Haman should be killed and his people put to death by Mordechai, because Mordechai is a melech. And the law of Milchemes Amalek is a battle that should be fought by the melech. But yet, there's something very strange. In the 8th chapter of Megillas Esther, it says, with regard to Mordechai and the Igros, the letters that he sent to Klal Yisrael, the pasuk reads, "Asher nasan hamelech laYudim likahev la'amod al nafsham lashmid laharog labeid u'shlalom lavot." The Igeres that was sent out by Mordechai to the Jewish people included those last two words, u'shlalom lavos, that they should take the booty from their enemies. How could that be? Here we're saying that, based on Rabbeinu Bechai that we discussed at great length, there's an Iser to benefit from the Nechasim, the possessions of Amalek. And Rabbi Zelo Sholchvas Yada. Why does it say Ushlalom Lavos? Comes along the Baal HaKedah with an unbelievable chiddush. And he says that Mordechai wanted to guarantee that the Igros that he would send out, those letters, would be identical to the letters that were originally sent out by Achashverosh. The first set of letters sent out by Achashverosh said, Lamod, it says that the Goyim are allowed to kill the Jews, and lavuz es rechusham, and to take the possessions of the Jews for themselves. And Achashverosh believed in Haman, that the Jewish people are this fifth column. They're threatening to rebel against the king, and therefore we will not only destroy them, we'll take their possessions. So in order to make sure that his Igros, meaning the second set of letters sent out by Mordechai, would be identical to the first set of letters that were sent out under the supervision of Haman by Achashverosh, Mordechai again told the people Shalom Lavot, that just like in the first set of letters, Achashverosh allowed the people to take possession over the rechush of the Jewish people. Now the king is giving Mordechai the green light to take possession over the possessions of the enemies of the Jews. Now there are a number of minhagim. Bisman hazeh, we don't have the ability to destroy Amalek, but we want to somehow fulfill the mitzvah of mechias Amalek, at least in some sense, to remember Amalek. So one of the minhagim that is codified by the Sefer HaManhig is that children of Israel in France and Provence 800 years ago would draw pictures of Haman on wood and stone, and then they would beat up the wood and the stone. And that was a kind of mechias shmo, al derech timche es zecher Amalek. Today, we have a common minhag that when Haman's name is mentioned in the Megillah, we bang with a grager. There are those who have a minhag to bang in the grager every single time that the name Haman is mentioned. That's a common minhag that we're all familiar with. There's another minhag that only on the first mention of Haman and the last, we bang for the name of Haman. And there's another minhag that only when it says Haman ben Hamidasa ha'agagi, and the pasuk goes out of its way to bimiyaches Haman to Agag, then we bang at the name of Haman. This could be very beneficial, by the way, for the Baal Koreh, because he gets a headache from all the banging. Anyway, so there's a pasuk that says that Mirashayim Yetze Resha. So we want to show how the Resha, the evil of Amalek, is passed on from one generation, from Agag, all the way down to Haman. However, the Chidah, his name was Azulai, he lived about 2.5 centuries ago. He has a whole new interpretation of why we bang for Haman. I'm looking here at Joe, and I'm reminding myself of a family called the Nussbaums. They were a great family in our shul. My father was the rabbi in Flatbush in Brooklyn, and the Nussbaums, and I think David also is connected to the Nussbaums. Anyway, the Nussbaums used to come on Purim. It was unbelievable. They had drums that were about 6 feet high. At least that's how I remember them. I was a kid, so maybe they were only 3 feet high, but to me they looked 6 feet high. And they had a graga that looked about 6 feet long, and so forth and so on. They would come in with all their musical instruments and make a tremendous ruckus at the name of Haman. Says the Chidah, what's this business about? Rash, to make such a loud noise, who pierced gadol makim lahaman, what's it about? And he says an unbelievable chiddush. In the name of Sam Chacham, he writes that during the long and bitter golus, the exile, when we're afraid that there'll be another king amongst the nations who will rise against us with a decree like Haman, and we saw that unfortunately not long ago. Therefore, they wanted a minhag that would publicize the great joy at the destruction and defeat of Haman. That here Haman wanted to, with his decree, wanted to destroy every last Jew, annihilate the people of Israel. And now we want to publicize that God came to our defense and he brought about a great salvation of the people of Israel. And when the people of the nations will hear, they'll walk by the synagogues and they'll hear this great ruckus and all this noise, they'll ask, what's this noise about? And they'll get the message that you don't start up with the Jewish people. Unfortunately, they didn't get that message, but that's what the Chidah says is the minhag. And he quotes a piyut of the Ibn Ezra, Avram Ibn Ezra, for Purim, Shomei Davar Ben Hamdasa, those who listen to follow the words of Ben Hamdasa, that's Haman, Tipol Aleim Emasa. They will be overwhelmed by fear. Why? Because they'll realize how the Jewish people were redeemed and saved by the Almighty. And this concept of the Chidah was embellished generations later by another great Sephardic Chacham by the name of the Ben Ish Chai. And he writes, which you'll see here on the top of page 178, that this could shed a whole new light on why the miracles of Purim are concealed miracles. They're b'derech hateva. He says the following: if the miracle of Purim would have been miraculous in a supernatural way, then they wouldn't have achieved the goal that throughout the long, bitter exile, our enemies would be afraid of the Jewish people. They'll say that, look, at the time of Esther and Mordechai, there were Nevi'im. There was Chagei Zchari Malach. And therefore, they were zochet to miracles. But today, the Jewish people already are forlorn, rejected people. They have no more prophets, and we don't have to be afraid of them. Therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought about the salvation of the Jewish people, b'derech hateva, to warn our enemies that this salvation, this protection and providence of God for his people is in all generations, whether we have Nevi'im or whether we don't have Nevi'im. It's all built into Teva. And I would add my following comment: even if our enemies don't get the message, we have to get the message. And we have to realize that we have to have faith in the Almighty, and that He, capital H, has the power to bring about great miracles, even if it's only b'derech hateva. Rav Mirsky here in the Hegyonei Halacha tells us that his father used to tell him that the older generation of sofrim, of scribes, had the minhag that when they brought in a new kulmus, they had to break in a new, how do you say kulmus? Not a pen, what's it called?
Quill.
A quill. When they wanted to test out the quill to see if it would work, what they would do is they would write Amalek on a piece of paper, and then they would destroy it. And in that way, they were Makayim the mitzvah of Mechias Amalek. And he found in a sefer called Kav HaYashar, in the name of one of the earlier geniuses of the Gaonim, that the minig was that when they wanted to test out the new quill, they would write Amalek, they would write Zeresh. I mean, she deserves a mechika worse than Haman, in my opinion. But anyway, now, this last paragraph here in this chapter about Rechush Amalek is very interesting. Very cute. There's a Gemara in Baba Basra Daf Mem Vav, which gives simonim. You know that there are all sorts of simonim throughout the entire Shas, in which you know, if the Gemara is going to quote one statement after another statement, after another, we take the first letter of each statement, and that's a mnemonic device to help us remember it. And Pilei Ploim, the Gemara in Baba Basra Mem Vav, when it wants to refer to the following in Yonim, it is Orev, Milva, Lokeach, and Kablan. 4 paragraphs that open with those words. And it says, Simonech Amalek, Ayin Mem Lamed Mem Me'aku. So Rav Yaakov Emden, who lived about 5+ centuries ago, he says, Tama Dover, the Torah says to destroy the name of Amalek. And now you give me a simon to remember the name of Amalek. And with Amalek, I remember the sequence of the various paragraphs in that Sugya Baba Basra. How could it be that we use the name Amalek as a memory device when the name Amalek is something that we want to destroy and forget about? Timchezech Amalek. So one answer that he offers is that when we learn Torah, we create a power, a force that's exactly antithetical to Amalek. And for the sake of creating that power through Talmud Torah and enhancing our Talmud Torah, we're allowed to write the word and the name Amalek as a memory device. But on the last page, page 179, he has a fascinating explanation, or shall we say, a source that justifies using the name Amalek to remember, because we look at the Tamei Mikra. The Torah says, Timcha zecha Amalek mitachas hashamayim lo tishkach. Now, lo tishkach are 2 words that are meant to be conjoined. And they should, in a chibur, you should have what's called a mercha instead of a tipcha. So let me read it to you inside. He says, Hayad Dina, according to the strict rules of Tamei Mikra, Shel Tevas Lo, Lios Mechuberes El Tevas Tishkach, Lios Mutemes B'mercha. And then you read it, Lo Tishkach, in a mercha. But the tamim that we have, according to our tradition, has the word lo with a tipcha. A tipcha creates a stop. Mercha means let's go on, and tipcha separates. So why does the Tamei HaMikra indicate that we should separate the word lo from the word tishkach? And the answer is, by separating lo from tishkach, what you understand is that pa'amim tishkach and pa'amim lo tishkach. That sometimes you should remember Amalek and not forget Amalek. So tishkach means to forget Amalek, but lo as a separate, as a separate prefix is telling me, remember Amalek, don't forget Amalek. So when do we have tishkach and we should forget Amalek? And when do we have lo tishkach? Pa'amim tishkach, pa'amim lo tishkach. And the answer is that if for the sake of Talmud Torah, by remembering Amalek, we will enhance our ability to study Torah, then we read it lo tishkach, and we separate the two. I thought that was pretty sharp. Now, the Baal Torah Tmima adds another element here to the equation. And he says that the Rambam Shita is that if a descendant of Amalek comes to be Megayer, and he wants to accept upon himself mitzvahs, we're allowed to be makabel him. And therefore, he says, that's why the lo is separated from tishkach. That in certain cases, the Torah says on tishkach lo, meaning don't forget, but rather remember. Remember the Amaleki who wants to come to be Miskay. Now, the next chapter is about Tainus Esther. And here I'll raise Bruce's question to you. Next Wednesday, I think in Chutz La'aretz is a fast day. Is that so? Is that a problem for us to get together on a fast day, or maybe have a long davening? I don't know.
It's also a fast day in Jerusalem.
Yeah, but I don't think we have such a long davening, as far as I know. So you'll let me know.
No, I mean, it depends on what time you're davening minter. It's not
okay, but I'm just suggesting that we skip this next chapter, which is about Tainus Esther, fascinating chapter, and we'll learn it on Tainus Esther, if that works out. In any event, we're going to open up now to a chapter which continues what we've been discussing until now, and that is page 190. Esther u'Mordechai mitaknim chet Shaul HaMelech. Okay. Achashverosh gives the okay to Haman. Lasos beYehudim kitov beinov lahashpid la'arig la'abed is kol Yehudim. And Mordechai sends a very harsh message to Esther. And he commands her to come in front of the king. L'schane lo levakesh milafanav al ama. And Esther responds, Ani lo asher lo yikra achas daso lahamis, ani lo nikresi loval amelech zesh lochim yom. Mordechai responds, Al tidami ben afshech limolei beis hamelech mikol haYehudim, ki im hakaresh tachrishi beis hazos, revach batzala yamod laYehudim mimakom acher, vi'at ubeis avich tovedu. What's this ubeis avich? The Megillah already testifies that her father was dead before she was born. That's in the second chapter of Esther. It says, Ki Ela Av Va'em. Her mother died at childbirth, and while she was an embryo, her father died. So what is the reference here, the emphasis on beis avich? And furthermore, why should Beis Avich be destroyed? Why is Mordechai warning Esther that if she doesn't rise to the occasion to plead the case and save the Jewish people, then Vi'at, that I understand, she deserves a punishment for that. But Beis Avich, why should Beis Avich suffer because of the sin of Esther? And the answer is, and it's quoted in many different commentaries on Megillus Esther that Mordechai was Mizera Shaul. As we discussed earlier, the name of the Targum Sheni, Mordechai was a direct descendant, Ben Acher Ben of Shaul Amalek. And therefore, why did this Gzera come about? This terrible Gzera against the Jewish people? The answer is because of the Chet of Shaul. Shaul saved Agag, and on that very night, before Shmuel put Agag to death, Agag impregnated a woman, and Haman was a descendant from that pregnancy. Now, exactly how Agag pulled this off, hours before he was destroyed, is a matter of controversy. There's one medrash that says that Agag actually had a relationship with a chamorah, with a female donkey. So the question is, how if we have a principle that a human being cannot be born to an animal? And the answer is that this chamorah was really a human being in the form of an animal, which is a reflection of what we saw in Rashi in Sefer Shmuel, where Rashi says on the pasuk Mishar v'yad chamor Misev v'yad gamal that these were Amalekim who were experts in sorcery, and they showed up looking like animals. Okay, that's one explanation, which is somewhat interesting as to how Agag was able to impregnate a woman before he was killed. In any event, Lo Gilgal, the Midrash says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Haman li'olam ela, because of Agag shaya bocher u'mesaneach b'shah shaya chavush b'beis hasurim shema ye'oved zaro min ha'olam. And the Midrash seems to indicate that Agag was crying, and there was a certain compassion for him before he was destroyed. It was Shmuel who actually killed him, as a result, they allowed him somehow to have a relationship, and he impregnated a woman. And the famous piyut that many Ashkenazic Jews recite after the Megillah was Asher Heini, if you remember that one. It says over there, "B'kum aleinu adam rasha," referring to Haman, "Neitzer zdon mizera Amalek, v'lo zachar rachmei Shaul." The Amalekim, meaning Haman in this case, did not remember the great compassion that Shaul Amelech, ki bechemlaso al Agag nolad oyev. That somehow, as a result of sparing Agag, because Shaul had compassion on Agag, Amalek Haman was born. Haman was a result of that compassion. So the entire story of the Gzera of Lahairag Lahashmil Li'amid was indirectly caused by Shaul Amelech. And therefore, since Mordechai was Mizaro Shel Shaul, he has, Mordechai, and for that matter Esther as well, an obligation to, in a sense, save Shaul from the cherpa and the busha in the fact that he sinned, and his sin was the cause, the original cause of the Gzera against the Jewish people at the time of Purim. Why is Esther, as the descendants of Shaul, personally responsible to rectify the sin? And that's the shalah that we learned earlier. Kol adam chayav l'taken et chete beis avosav, ubi oso davar atzmo shekilku avosav bo yisaknu atoldos. And that's why avoseinu chatu v'einam v'anachnu avoseim sovlim We have to fix up the sins of our ancestors to the best that we can. And therefore, it's critical that Esther play the role to bring about the downfall of Haman. And that would be a tikkun, because it would show in his error and his sin of compassion on Agag that was responsible for Haman. So now to fix that up, Esther has to personally be involved in bringing down Haman. So Mordechai says to Esther, you now have a golden opportunity to save Klal Yisrael and destroy Zerah Amalek and fix up the sin of Shaul, your great-grandfather. If you don't do so, God will take care of us. But at ubeis avich tovedu, you will be destroyed. God will not save you because you don't deserve to be saved. And beis avich also, meaning Shaul HaMelech, will have to suffer that busha. V'shuv lo yeh tikun lechetot shel Shaul. It's possible that God designated you to be the Malka, the queen in the base Achashverosh. Why? In order to save Klal Yisrael. Levakesh, to ask Rachamim from the king to save the Jewish people. Lahatil is base Avich Shaul, to save your great-grandfather Shaul Shelo Ye'onesh B'Marom. So basically, you, Esther, have been put in a unique position in a double sense. Number one, you're in a unique position to rectify the sin of your great-great-grandfather and protect him, save him from punishment by being attacking his chet. Number two, you're in a wonderful position, placed by divine providence, to save your people and yourself by pleading the case of the Jewish people. Now we have a principle, and this I love, called lahachzir es haTorah liyoshna. When the crown is removed, give me a second to fix this up.
Right.
If it works, if the technology works.
I don't think we have any emergency right now.
Okay.
I think it worked. I don't know. I'm not sure. Anyway, we got rid of the background noise, so that's good. Listen to this. I mean, this is really fascinating. Lahachzir aTorah liyoshna. God had taken away the crown of kingship from Shaul. What was Shaul's major sin? He had a number of sins, but his primary sin for which he was denied the Malchus was the fact that he had compassion on Agag, on Amalek. What is lahachzir aTorah liyoshna in this context? Malchus comes back to Shaul HaMelech. Not exactly Shaul, but it comes back and returns to Esther, the descendant of Shaul. And in a footnote, I would add my own point here. We said before that Mordechai was also a melech. And Mordechai is a descendant of Shaul. So that it's lahachzir aTorah liyoshna for both the Malchus of Esther, the Malchus of Mordechai. And the Midrash says, Omer Rab Chanina, B'lashon shenitla Malchus mizkena, from Hazaken, meaning from Esther's great-great-grandfather Shaul, is B'lashon zu chazra Malchus. Unbelievable. Watch this. When Shmuel has to reveal the unhappy news to Shaul that the Malchus is being taken away from him, listen to what Shmuel says. V'nitna l'reacha hatov mimcha. Nasna, God has given the Malchus to Reacha. In the first chapter of Megillas Esther, The pasuk says, "Umalchusa," referring to Vashti, "Yitain hamelech l'reusa hatova mimenu." It's mamish word for word. What a medrash! And this is called lahachzer ator Yoshna. That malchus, which was taken away from Shaul, is now replaced and given to Esther. Unbelievable. Now he quotes another medrash in Parshas Balak. When the Ruach Elokim rests on Bilam, he declares Yizal Mayim Midolyo, and the medrash says that this dripping of water, the water is in a receptacle, there's a hole in the receptacle, and all the water is falling out of the receptacle. That's a remez to Malchuso Shel Shaul. Kidli sheyesh lo hefsek. A dli is meant to retain the water, but in the case, right, and the Malchus of Shaul is meant to be transmitted through all his generations, but instead, it's yesh lo hefsek. It's going to be cut off. V'al yedei ma, why is it that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was mafsik Malchus Shaul? That's the Medrash's question, based on the Zal Katal Imasi, Midolyo, of Bilam. Al yedei Agag, because of Agag, shenemar vayarem me'Agag Malko. Another pasuk in Bala. Says the Medrash, Afal Pichein Choseres, the Malchus returns v'nises and is carried from Shaul to Esther. Shenemar vatinasei Malchuso. All the psukim fit into place according to the Medrash in order to convey on an allusion, not explicitly, but alluded to the fact that the Malchus is now, it will be removed from Shaul and returned to Esther. And therefore, Esther rises to the occasion after Mordechai impacts on her. Vayehi bayom hashlishi, she fasts for 3 days. Vatilbash Esther Malchus. What does that mean? It should have said, asks Chazal Medrash, Vatilbash Esther Bigdei Malchus. The word Bigdei was omitted, says the Medrash. Melamed, this means that the pasuk is not describing the clothes that she's wearing, but Shalavcha Malchus base Avia. She is now extending the Malchus of her great-great-grandfather of Shaul. L'takein chet zekena b'tshuvas hamishkal, where Shaul had compassion on Agag, Esther has no compassion whatsoever on Haman. Those, I don't even want to talk about them, but those left-wing guys, I don't want to mention them. They say, oh, how could you destroy Amalek? This, that, those same people usually, I think, maybe I'm wrong about this, I'm being naive, they have a great deal of respect for Esther Amalek. She's very popular, is she not? And yet, as we'll see now, that wonderfully populated, sweet, beautiful, wonderful Esther. And who doesn't have a member of their family with the name Esther, right? That same Esther has no compassion on Amalek. She will now be a tikkun, a rectification of the misplaced and misguided compassion of her great-grandfather Shaul. Because b'milchamto im Amalek nimchuru rachmav shel Shaul al Agag, shenemar vayachmol Shaul v'ha'am al Agag. But Esther is the exact opposite. Shekol sarah me'es hamelech al Haman, Haman mischanen al nafsho v'nafal amita asher Esther aleha. And Haman is pleading for his life and trying to arouse the compassion of Esther. Esther lo nimcharu rachmel Haman, lo richma alav. She would not spare Haman. And knowing full well that the king in his anger would hang up Haman All the power to him. Esther kivna shetia milchamta Amalek kidugma milchama shenitztava b'zkein shol ubiasiya yovo cheto shel shol al tikuno. Ketzad. And now we embark upon a fascinating journey to show an exact parallel between the milchama of Shaul against Amalek and the milchama of Esther against Amalek. Watch this. This is fascinating. There are two categories of war. One is milchemet magen, a defensive war. V'acheres, and the second one is milchemes nakem, a revenge against our enemies. We take revenge and we fight the battle. Today we're seeing a different type of waging war. It doesn't fit into any of those categories. It's neither defensive nor nakem. Okay, but that's, you can see the power of one individual. I mean, it's just unbelievable. Now let's take a look at the battles that we fight historically against Amalek. The first battle was Moshe Rabbeinu appointing Yoshua, say v'ilachem b'Amalek. The pasuk says, "Vayavo Amalek v'yilachem im Yisrael b'Refidim." Amalek comes from far away to initiate a battle against Klal Yisrael in a place called Refidim. Now we fight a defensive war against Amalek. Vayomer Moshe el Yoshua b'char l'cha anoshim v'tzei v'ilachem b'Amalek. However, in the case of Shaul HaMelech, the pasuk says, this is Shmuel in the name of God, Pakadati es asher asa Amalek l'Yisrael. Pakadati means I remember way back when, in the distant past, what Amalek perpetrated against the Jewish people. That's already a different category of milchama. That's a milchemes naken. And that's what Shaul was commanded to battle. And enter front stage Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner, the Rosh Hashiva of Chaim Berlin, in his Pachad Yitzchak on Purim, number 15. And Mordechai and Esther are going to fight two battles against Haman and Amalek. Two battles. One battle that parallels Moshe Rabbeinu, and the other that parallels Shaul HaMelech. B'mei Achashverosh nechlek hamilchama l'shtei yomim, Yom Yud Gimel, v'Yom Yud Dalet. On Yom Yud Gimel, in the pasuk says, Nikalu haYehudim lishloach yad b'mavakshay ra'asam, and earlier it says Lamod al nafsham, Vayasu b'soneim kirtzonam. All this is a defensive battle, because these are, quote, mevakshay ra'asam. That's how the pasuk describes those who were killed, 75,000, not a small number, of our enemies. And the Alshich says that what the Jews did to their sonim is exactly what the sonim had meant to do to the Jews. Lahashmid ula'abed. This is a milchemes magen, a defense milchama, in which the enemy is trying to perpetrate a milchama, and we just send it back. You know, we take the arrows and we send it back. And that milchama against Amalek is a milchama of magen. But on Yom Yudalit, on the 14th, it doesn't say Lamod al Nafshim. On the 14th, Lo Haisa Milchemes Magen, but rather Li Nakem Me'oivehem. And that Nekama, which we'll mention in our bracha after Megillah reading, Nakam es Nikmasam, etc., etc., Vayakilu Yehudim Asher b'Shushan Gam Yom Arbasar, Vayargu b'Shushan Chamesh Mos Ish. And the pasuk, in a very oblique, in a very obvious way, leaves out Lamod al Nafsham, because the milchama on Yom Yudalid was like and parallel the milchama of Shaul HaMelech, Pakadati, which is a milchama of Nakem. And Esther asks from the king, please give us a second day to fight those battles of Nakem. This has nothing to do with self-defense. This is not about, well, they didn't have compassion on us. They want to destroy us. We don't have compassion on them. No. This is pure milchemes Amalek without any element of compassion. And this is Vatilbash Esther Malchus. She now steps into the shoes of her great-grandfather Shaul Amelech to be metaken his chait and take a Milchemes Nakem and fulfill it to the T without any element of compassion. Shaul was meant to do the same, but he had compassion. Ish Yudi Hayah b'Shushana b'Yoshua Mordechai ben Yair ben Shavi ben Kish Ish Yemini. And we mentioned earlier the Megillah Starim. Why mention 4 generations and go back to Kish? And the answer is, this is a remez that Mordechai is a descendant of Shaul. And it says Ben Shimei, Ben Yair Ben Shimei. Shimei was a person who was Chayiv Misa to David Amelech. He was a Mored b'Malchus. Why didn't David Amelech have Shimei put to death? The answer is because David Amelech saw Baruch HaKodesh that Mordechai was going to descend from Shimei. And now we have Bruce's question. So why does the pasuk why does it go back to Kish, the father of Shaul? Mordechai tikein escheto shel Shaul's keno al yedei she harages Shama Haman v'chol zaro v'yod Amalekim rabin u'mipnei malo kasav hakasav ben Shaul. If the point is that Mordechai was fixing up the sin of Shaul, why does it mention Shaul? Says the Megillah Starim, Heyos v'Shaul garam l'kol tzaras Haman. Shaul was the indirect cause of the entire tragedy, the catastrophe, the dooming, impending destroying of the Jewish people through Haman. Lo rotza kosav lahaskir shmo. The Torah had compassion on Shaul and omitted his name, al ha'onesh hara, on what could have been, if not for Esther and Mordechai, a terrible punishment. So Shaul, number 1, does not kill Agag. Number 2, he doesn't destroy the tzon and the bakar. He's basically afraid of the people who have compassion over the animals. And now Mordechai comes to be metaken, the sin of Shaul, that he didn't kill Agag, and therefore he destroys Haman and many of his descendants and Amalekim Rabim. And what about the fact that Shaul did not kill the animals? He had compassion on the animals. Keneged masha otu ala Shaul. The answer is Mordechai commands them, lo l'shloach yodam babiza. Don't go near the animals. Don't take them. Don't enjoy them. Don't benefit from them. Ubabiza lo sholchu es yodam. Now watch this. If you take a look at the first letter in these 4 words, the first letters in these 4 words, lo sholchu es yodam, is Lamed, Shin, and the last letter, I guess, sometimes you use the first and the last letter, Vav, and Lamed. So we have the name Shaul here in Babizalo Sholchu es yodam. This is going to be a tikkun for the chait of Shaul. Rabbi Pinchas Amar Mordechai Melech al Yisrael. Shenevar Mordechai Yotza milifnei HaMelech b'levush Malchus. So Chazra Atorah Liyoshna, not only in Esther the Malka, but also in Mordechai. Mordechai is now coming to be metaken the sin of Shaul. When Shaul says to Shmuel, Ki yaresi es ha'am v'ashma b'kolam, says the Malbim, Mitam ze nenash b'netilas ha'malchus mimenu. Why was the Malchus taken away from Shaul? Lefisha Amalek, what does it mean to be a king? Let's quote the Rambam. The Rambam tells us, Ein lo lira mi adam. I think this is the Rambam, I'm not sure. Anyway, Ein lo lira mi adam v'liftach mi amo u'min Hashem yasur levavam. So that Shaul was guilty of being afraid of his flock, of the community. How did Mordechai rectify that sin? Mordechai lo kara v'lo shtach v'lo haman. And the people said to Haman, as recorded in the Medrash, you are causing us to fall at the sword. And the pasuk says, no. Lo kara v'lo zah v'lo shtach v'lo haman. Lo shah l'divrei ha'am. Fi amad eitan b'daito v'lo kara v'lo shtach v'lo haman. Mordechai represents the steadfast dedication against the will of the people to stand up and do what's right and not bow down to Haman, who had set himself up, of course, as an avodah zarah. And in that sense, Mordechai and Esther covered the entire gamut of all the deficiencies of Shaul and fixed it all up. I wanted to add one idea before we end. Why does the Megillah make such a big deal about the letters that Mordechai sent out and the impact of those letters that went out l'chol medina midah kichsava kilshona throughout the medinos of Achashverosh and Rabbim mi'amei ha'aretz misyad, and so many of the non-Jews in Paras U'Madai who received those ksav, those igros, converted to Judaism. After all, we're not big on conversion. We don't try to missionize. That's not our thing. But yet the Megillah goes out of its way to emphasize that dimension of Rabbim Misyad. And I want to offer two answers. One answer, based on what we learned today, is that this element of Pachad and Ema, of Nafla Emas Ha'oivim Aleim, is exemplified, is embellished by the fact that there are so many goyim that are afraid of the Jewish people. It's really vanafochu when a guy is afraid of a Jew. And that could have perhaps a ripple effect impact on our enemies throughout the generations, as we saw in the Chidah about publicly making the raucous over the name Haman. But I think perhaps we can add another element into the equation. How is it that a guy decides to convert to Judaism? It seems so unlikely that such a thing could happen. And if you're talking about pachad, then the question is, why did this guy convert, not this guy? it seems that there's some sort of, if I could call it, a religious arousal, a hisorus, an experience that a guy could have to draw him to Judaism, to want to convert. And I think if you speak to converts, I'm talking about a real emistic, a ger tzedek, he or she will tell you that they had some sort of an experience which woke them up to the truth of Judaism, and they wanted to be part of the Jewish people and the Jewish religion. There was something in the ksav of Mordechai that aroused and awakened within the non-Jews a spiritual drive, a motivation to be part of the Jewish people, the Jewish religion. What was in that ksav? The Taz is medayik from the Psukim that Mordechai was very careful to leave out the name of God from Megillas Esther. It doesn't appear anywhere. And there's a fascinating paradox here, because the Shulchan Aruch paskins in Hilchot Shabbos that matzilin mipnei adleika, that we're allowed to save Kisvei HaKodesh when a fire breaks out on Shabbos, but not Megillas Esther, says the Taz, because the name of God doesn't appear in Megillas Esther. So on the one hand, we're saying that Megillas Esther, in its kedusha and its sanctity, is on a lower level than the rest of Tanakh. And Ein Matzilin Esther Mipnei Adleika. Why? Because the name of God doesn't appear even once in Megillas Esther. But the Taz adds another dimension. And he says that why was Mordechai so careful to deliberately omit the name of God? Because he was sending this ksav with the entire story of the Megillah to the Goyim. Kol Medina, Kilshona, Olam Vam, Kilshona, etc. He didn't want the name of God to be desecrated. And therefore he omitted the name of God. But on the other hand, as a result of the fact that Mordechai sent these ksavim without the name of God to every nation, every province of the 127 of Parasu Madai, is Rabbi Misyadim Aleim. Many Goyim decided to join the Jewish people. It seems that a tzaddik like Mordechai is able to send a message in a book form to the Goyim. A guy wakes up one day and he reads his own national ksav, in this case written by Mordechai, and it was sent to him through Mordechai, and he finds out that God in his providence, without mentioning his name, it's totally concealed, protected his people. And by reading the ksav, he's awakened to realize that God protects his people in a disguised way, concealed way. His name doesn't appear. It's all al pi derech hateva. But every piece of the puzzle indicates that it was divine providence to override the original Gzeira of Haman in the first set of letters with a new set of letters, a ksav that's sent out by Mordechai to all the Goyim. And they wake up one morning and they read this letter. It's like it's posted on social media. And what does it say? It says, Balayla hu noda shnas hamelech, etc., the whole story of Vashti and Esther and everything else, and the destruction of the enemies. That's what they read. And some of them were aroused. Those who have a more sensitive soul, and maybe they could feel sanctity to some extent. Those goyim were awakened by the awe of the Jewish people. And that awe of the Jewish people is a reflection of the fact that Almighty God protects them, as we saw here. And that's why the Megillah makes such a big deal about the Ravim Yami Oretz Nisyan. Okay, this is where we'll stop for today. And Rabbosai, you'll let me know if